Welcome to Art with Oz, your front row seat to the stories behind the Indian art world and the trailblazers that define it. Today we have with us Mr. Martand Khosla, one of India's leading contemporary artists, who was actually an architect before he became an artist. So tell me, I'd love to hear, how did you transition from being an architect to an artist?
I haven't transitioned. I remain sort of actively practicing both architecture and art. So I think that I look at it as a practice, they're completely different. But as how I think about it, they're more or less kind of both the practices kind of, for me, probe similar questions about the city, about urbanism, about India, about the global south.
And how do these roles inform each other in your work?
I think to understand that, I would have to go back a little bit, tell you about what sort of, how the transition or the branching out or the broadening of it essentially occurred. And I'll try and make it as succinct as possible. But essentially what happened is that when I studied architecture at a place which was a very liberal architecture, so it was not mandatory at all to design buildings in it. So in fact, I spent 5 years of my education, I think only 1 year did I design a building. The rest of the time we were thinking about ideas, thinking about design, thinking about solutions for cities that didn't necessarily involve architecture. I think that it's a mistake to always think that to be an architect, it means that you have to always build. Sometimes to be an architect means to not build, right? And I think choice of building or not building was not sort of at the base of this. What lay at the core of it was that the conversations were much more about cities and what role do architects play in transforming cities, in creating and imagining futures and in enabling them to happen.
And what role do you think that is?
I think the role of architects at one level is to kind of imagine new futures, right? And those futures, depending on how you think politically, could have to do with, essentially you try and make cities that are, this is according to me, that enable others to live their sort of life to their fullest. Which basically essentially talks about accessibility, it talks about safety, it talks about public spaces, it talks about recreational spaces, it talks about allowing essentially the poor to be able to ply their businesses, for there to be hawkers, for cities to function, right? Now, we are a city which has many, many very poor people, and in a sense that I think a good city would be one that creates opportunities for all of them, and safety and security. So, for instance, what you find is that not only do architects would ideally, in an ideal world, propose ideas, and the citizens of a city, in an ideal world, would become participants. They would come in and say, yes, this works for us, this doesn't work for us. Or they turn out and say, what we really need is a playground, or what we really need is for the weekly markets. And if you've traveled around Delhi, you'll notice that all over street markets crop up across the city. So, how do you enable those? So, so some people may say, look, this is what we need to do. And so these conversations begin with architects at some level, and with planners, and with sociologists and anthropologists. And I think that's how you make a city be a great city. I don't think you make a city a great city by filling it with shiny looking buildings and lots of fences where people can't cross into, various areas, which is kind of the direction that we're going in right now. So coming back to what I was saying, so Architecture College is really about thinking about these ideas. Like, how do you empower communities, local communities, architects? How do they become participants in changing our cities? But when I came here and started practicing, what I found was that, we would have a client who would say, look, build a school for us, or a cafeteria, or a house. And we had a plot of land, but we weren't part of a larger discourse. So our practice of architecture became limited. It became, in terms, at one level, it was very interesting, but it was about creating forms and built forms on private or institutional land. It wasn't really going beyond that to talk about like what's happening on the street, what's happening beyond that, right? So I think that, 10 years of that practice was fantastic from a point of view of creating interesting buildings and, exploring these ideas. But what it was not doing was it was not allowing me to think all the ideas that were bubbling up in my head. There was no sort of space for those to kind of be played out and for me to question them or to engage with other people. So I went through phase of where I was trying to do a little bit of teaching, I was doing a little bit of writing, but it wasn't sort of, I found I didn't really like that. So eventually I sort of moved into, I quite organically actually, I think quite organically, I just would come home and would start kind of, initially started making drawings with rubber stamps of workers who are working on my construction site. Because I was thinking politically, I was thinking about like, who are the migrant laborers? Like, you know, in India, it was the first point of starting a conversation with myself. You found that, you know, workers would be coming from villages and they'd come and then they'd set up home around, like they would live around the site where they would build. And then their lives were there, the children were there, you know, everyone would work, kids were growing up, they'd build this building and then they'd move out, you know. So this is happening. So it's kind of, that was the first point of probing about like, you know, what is it that sort of enables this to happen? What does it mean for people who are working on the site, their relationships with the building? And from there, the conversations kind of, you know, moved. So I think for 2 years, I was just making art just for myself, I think, just because it helped me try and process things.
Architecturally, what responsibility do you feel like architects have in the modern day society?
Look, I think architects play different roles in society. I mean, there are architects who write about architecture. In that sense, that's, you know, they fulfill a certain role. There are others who teach architecture and they fulfill a certain role. And there are others who imagine futures, make drawings, but they don't necessarily build. They play a different role. And then there are those that sort of actually do what people more traditionally understand as architecture, which is that they design and build. So I think that, like the health system, it's not only doctors, you know, there are public health workers, there are sort of epidemiologists, there are doctors, you know, there are nurses, so what happens is you must see this as a larger landscape. The role and duty of architects is kind of, you know, is very wide, actually. And I can't sort of like what the role of architects in society is. I think these are questions that individuals must sort of, you know, ask of themselves, you know.
On an individual basis, as an architect and an artist, what do you feel like your role is?
I don't know what my role is. I think the minute you start saying something like, what is my role? I'm kind of, you know, you put yourself in a position where you kind of give yourself some pedestal of importance from outside. So I don't think I won't look at it like that. So in a sense, I will answer your question in a slightly different way. And I would say that what is it that I feel how I want to engage with architecture. So I don't know what my role in it is. But what I'm exploring for myself through my art is I am looking at sort of, you know, how our cities function. You know, the collapse of the cities, the re-emergence of the cities, the conflicts within the cities. This sort of really is what interests me to see. And the other part of me is interested in kind of, you know, creating interesting spaces. So which is a kind of becomes, I think I see that as a more of a selfish pursuit for me, right? Which is a formal pursuit. I enjoy doing that. You know, I want to make interesting buildings, right? And so that's really it. I think intellectually and through the art, I like to think about it at a macro level. Through the architectural practice, I think about it. I think about design and space and volume and light and, you know, all of this, but at a more micro level, right?
On that macro level, you've explored themes of migration and displacement in your works. Have you had any personal experiences that have driven you to this?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are personal experiences because, you know, it is, as I was mentioning to you earlier, that, you know, you go to site and you see people and you see little children there and they're working on this site. Then that's a site so my conversation began at first at a very basic level of like, you know, how do I engage with the people who are working on buildings that I have designed? Or do I engage with them at all or not? Do I look at them? Do I see them or not? Like, those are kind of the really sort of simple things. So it was, of course, that you look at the people, you acknowledge the people, you work with the people, at times, not all of them, but, you know, who are making your buildings. But what that does is it's a bit like pulling a little thread on a sweater, right? And you just keep pulling it and you're pulling it and you're pulling it and you're pulling it and it just keeps unraveling.
Yeah.
But I think what happened is that an intellectual kind of engagement with ideas of migrant labor and those who build our buildings led to conversations about larger questions, like how many people are migrating to cities? What is happening in the hinterlands? why are these migrations happening? Where are the employment opportunities? What are the health indicators? Then where do migrants, then it moves from there beyond just the construction workers, right? A lot of them who are more seasonal, sort of they come in for 3 months, 6 months, they go back, another lot come in. This is also, there are different patterns of how labor comes to the cities for construction. But when you move beyond that, there are questions about more permanent migrations, right? Which then you lead to looking at the informal city. So like a majority of Delhi is informal. It's built as, there are slum clusters, they're called the Juggi Jhopdi one, semi-urban, semi-legal, illegal. And you find that Delhi is just filled, not just Delhi, every city in India has slums. And so those are migrants and they come in here, and so they sort of start having, there's a larger conversation about cities and the fabric of the cities and what people are doing, and also then the politics of so that then invariably led to say, okay, so then you have a slum, let's say in the center of Delhi, what happens? And then, but what are they doing? They are picking up the waste, they're recycling waste, they're cleaning the drains, they are sort of working in houses. There's all of this stuff happening. And then you'll have a demolition drive. And so then people are then thrown out. Now, if they have certain papers, etc., they're able to, maybe if they're very lucky, get some form of compensation. Then you kind of move them to the periphery of the city, but they don't earn enough to be able to take public transport to the work that they used to do. So then you start realizing the dependence of the city on each other, basically, right? And then, so, it's as I said, it's like this thread that you keep pulling at, and you understand more and more about, I don't know, the more you know, the less you know kind of thing. But the more you want to kind of, question about what is it and how do our cities function? And so, that's why I was saying to you earlier that a great city is one that enables people to fulfill kind of their potentials to be, whatever they can be. Right now, attitudes have been very much about we'll move the poor out, we'll clean this up, right? And, I can go into kind of more detail about this, but so these are the kind of questions that were leading me, that was sort of running and informing the art practice as it was sort of, for me as it was starting.
And how do you feel like your work reflects these ideas?
I don't know. I think I see the works more as propositions and questions to myself. I don't claim that there are necessarily reflections at a larger scale, but at a personal scale, these are my thoughts about kind of, what I see around me, or things that are not resolved in my own mind about these things. So, you kind of, go along with it. And
for instance, can you explain the work behind us?
The work behind. I can't explain. So in principle, my attitude is to not try and explain works, because I think sometimes I don't even necessarily, sometimes they're more instinctive kind of forms that get generated. Because as I said, for me, I kind of see myself, my practice as also being sculpture heavy, right? And over the years, I think I'm kind of not looking necessarily at individual issues, but I'm kind of looking at systems and patterns, and I'm looking at, structural violence, overt violence, where sort of, I think what's happening in Gaza and Lebanon is also what I'm looking at a lot, actually. And so sometimes works are just kind of more reflective of a moment of,
Inspiration.
Or a kind of, they are also forms. As a sculptor, you make forms also, and there's a joy in that, right? So I think that, and I really enjoy the fact that people come and have their own readings of it as well. Mm. So I've always kind of been reluctant to do walkthroughs where I'm talking about work. I don't want to talk about it too much. I'll talk about issues. I'll talk about ideas. But, I think that's an interesting enough of a... Well, it's an interesting enough point. So I'm just look, I'm thinking about these things in several ways, right? And then, you may bring your own readings to it, which have led to very interesting conversations. Someone comes in and sort of starts talking about something, saying, look, I'm thinking of this. I know you're thinking of cities, but I'm thinking of this. And then, those are also conversations, right? For me.
Yeah. More about these mediums. The way I've seen you work, this is so different to what you were doing 8-9 years ago with the brick dust. How did you get from there to there?
I don't know, actually. I don't think I'd be able to answer that in a very clear way, but I'll try to stab. I think what happened, It's a good question. See, this is why I like conversation. They make you think about things you haven't really necessarily tried to articulate earlier. So if I kind of think about the things I was reading and how I was kind of, engaging with the city in the early years, I think what I was doing was I was looking at, let's look at the legal aspect of the cities and how does the law kind of look at slums around India? How does health look at slums around India? How does education, how does transport work and enable? So in a sense, in some way, I was trying to understand through issue-based aspects what was happening within the city. And by that, I mean, it's a bit, and I've used this analogy before, but it's the city is like you never understand it. It's an organism that's constantly evolving, and you're trying to kind of to say that you understand it is it's a huge mistake. So, but I think I see it as more as like those 10 blind men who are describing an elephant, and that's the analogy I've used in the past. That one person's touching the tusk and says, elephant's kind of smooth and very hard, and like kind of it makes a tick click noise. The other blind man's holding onto the tail and saying it's like a brush and bristly, and the third one's touching the trunk. But they're all true, and they're all descriptions are of that elephant, but they describe it very, very differently. So in a sense, I think that for me it would be ideal if I just spent my life just being different blind men exploring the city in different aspects. But I think that to come back to the point is that in the early part of the art practice, I was looking more at individual issues. And I think that what has happened over the years is that as I have spent more time sort of, studying it from a point of view of labor or law or transport or health or rights, I think more and more I've zoomed out. I've moved away from Delhi's and Bombay's and thinking of those as the grounds of where my learning comes from. But I've started to think about more of it as systems. Are there parallels here? Because I think what happened is that I read a book called Outcast London, which was talking about 18th, 19th century London. And it sounded very much like India, right? Like right now. And then you kind of, you read architects and urban planners talk about Caracas or Karachi or Dhaka. And you find that, there are similarities here in terms of systems that happen across the global south simultaneously in different forms. But if you go back in time, they're also happening in all the major large cities across the world. So if you go to the Tenement Museum in New York, or you read a book, or you go to the London Museum, so New York, London, fairly similar things are happening as they are in our cities right now. So you find that actually, so what I found interesting is that there are sort of patterns and repeating patterns. And I think as I started to explore those in my mind, I think I realized that for people, it was becoming the work, they were looking at it and thinking it's becoming more abstract. For me, it was just it was kind of, sometimes people who, make work, and it wasn't abstract for me at all. I was kind of thinking that, I was seeing these emergent patterns across cities in time and across the globe simultaneously. So I think what happened is that the work started to have this sense of, they changed fundamentally in their form. And to get there, I kind of went through a fairly tumultuous sort of phase where I felt I was not really making very good. I made some pretty bad. And it's fine. I think that's all part of part of that exploration is to kind of, because I realized that I wasn't, for me, it was not, where I was at was not enough. And I kind of needed it to be more. And so you try out things and what
inspired this change? How did you get to this practice?
This is the change. The change is that your realization that the urban condition is a repeating condition, right? And then sort of, you start seeing patterns. So, and then suddenly I started, and the more I zoomed out, I was starting to see more and more of these cycles of collapse and emergence and resistance. And, what I realized was that there was this kind of sense of energy and motion that was happening, right? And sometimes it's overt and it just is kind of violent. And sometimes it's kind of slower, but that change is kind of constantly happening.
Okay.
So when I started to sort of feel that sort of sense of it collapse and explode and collapse and explode, I think if I was to hazard a guess, this is what was happening, is that before sort of this work, there was that sense of how do people resist? Like, how do you resist change? And I think I've always looked at it from a domestic object point of view. So before this came the doors, right? And then there was the doors that were bending. Like, why? So in a sense, there was a sense that, objects doing things that they don't do. They don't typically do that, but they're also objects resisting external forces. So when you kind of, you bring a bulldozer to kind of, like, so it's not literal, but there is a sense of like, that there is a push and there's a bend and there's a, so there are ideas that I think what's happening is that you're jumping 10 years and I'm trying to kind of join those dots with a little path, a narrative path, basically, that talks about, one is a resistance to change and also like what happens. So a lot of the works that you see in the form of the clouds or the discs are very much about those kind of ideas of change and upheaval, basically. But before that, there's also this idea of the in-between city that I was exploring as a mesocosm. That was very much also plays into this ideas of how the city functions within the gaps and doesn't function, Maybe I'll do let me do a separate answer for this idea of mesocosm in a bit for you. Let me just think that through.
Okay. How has growing up in Delhi impacted your work?
Still trying to grow up. I think I grew up in a Delhi which was smaller. It was kind of, more accessible. It was safer. So, there was this whole aspect of a larger part of the city was accessible to us at your age, So I'd be kind of, we'd be on buses and jumping on scooters and going off to Chor Bazaar by the Lal Killa on a Sunday morning or sort of doing these kind of things. So that was a interesting link with the city because I think the more one jumps into the city, the less afraid one becomes of it, the more comfortable one becomes with it. So I think that was the early part. But I think Delhi is a great city, right? So if you think about it, it's historical, it's layered, it's a post-partition city. I mean, there is so much that Delhi holds in its history and so much depth, like, how far back it goes as a city that's been occupied and the position it's held also within the larger sort of political narrative of India, right? And then I think with partition, you kind of get this huge influx of people. So I come from a family that moved to Delhi from what is currently Pakistan. And then we have all of you have Gurgaon and Noida. So this is this kind of this incredible city, right? So it's a bit like, for an architect, it's like living in the, it's like being in this incredible library of urbanism, right? That you can kind of dip into and, pick little parts of it and you can engage with it and it's exciting. But I think the tools to be able to engage with it were kind of, for me, were developed when I was at college, right? So I think what happens is that when you go to college, you kind of, you really are kind of trying to challenge yourself intellectually and you're trying to read more, trying to know more. And it is those tools that you kind of come and, you deploy when you have the ability to do it. So I think when I returned and came back to Delhi after being away for 5-7 years, I was equipped with this stuff, which is why I felt it was very frustrating for me for the first 10 years to just use some of those tools. I kind of wanted to use all of those tools, And I think from that point of view, Delhi is great. But I think so would have Bombay would have been incredible, and so would have Calcutta. So I mean, like, it just so happens that I'm here, and because I've spent a childhood here, and I speak the language, I know the transport system, I know so it becomes a great enabler, so on to be able to engage with it. But so I think Delhi plays a very important role in my art practice, as a bouncing board or as a learning point, or sometimes as something I really wrestle with.
So you talked about this earlier. Actually, technology is rapidly changing the fields of art and architecture. Have digital tools impacted your work and your workflow in any way? And do you foresee any more future shifts?
Really, I've not really thought about technology in the sense, look, it's interesting. So the art practice for me is materially, so far, at least, I've kept it, it's always architectural materials. So I started with brick dust, I moved to cement, I then moved to wood, I worked in steel. Even the paint I use now is architectural paint. So I don't use traditional kind of, fine art materials. I've never used them. I'm more comfortable working with architectural materials. I see that there's a resonance of that. But along with that, I also then use architectural softwares. So if I'm doing, let's say, a laser drawing, which is a laser etching, then I'm using a software that I'm kind of comfortable working with. But in that sense, that I know that it's a laser etch, but the genesis of the work is much more analog, right? So almost all of these works, and not just these, the sculptures, everything is kind of in a sketchbook, one sketch at a time.
Okay.
So at first, the conceptualization of it is first in a sketch, then in a drawing. Same with the sculptures. So first in a sketch, then maybe a 3D, but a model, then a model. My process of working still is very architectural.
And how long does it take?
How long does what take?
It's relative, yeah.
What take? How long does what take?
Like you're from like when you start making a work to when you end it. Like, do you have
It totally depends on the work, right? So sometimes, like if I'm kind of having a moment where I feel that I really am kind of into something, then I'm working very hard at something, then I will ask someone to help me out with the computer stuff quickly, and I'll sit on their head till I kind of really get what it is that I've sketched out, and we get there. And sometimes, sometimes making a work may take a few months, and sometimes it literally happens within a week, 10 days.
Okay.
So it totally varies on what it is. So my practice also sort of small works, large works, laser drawings. So it's kind of varied. So I think what really takes time is to kind of arrive at a series that you're thinking about. And I think that's what really takes time, not so much, and then, you stay with it. So that's kind of how I work, at least.
Studying at the Architectural Association in London must have been transformative in your art journey. How did working there change your approach to your art and architecture?
So as I had mentioned earlier, it's a school that, so when I finished, I'm constantly undecided about what I want to do in life, right? So I think when I finished my school, I was like, do I really want to be an architect? Should I be an artist? Should I do product design? Should I go into film? Should I go into graphics? That was my kind of questions to myself, completely undecided. And so what I started to do was I took a year off. And I took a year off and I was like, okay, let me work with a graphic designer, let me work with an architect, let me work with a photographer, which was also something I was very interested in. So I spent sort of, a year trying out different things. And at the end of the year, I had no clarity at all. So I was still as undecided. So then what I did was through the year, I was going to go and I was visiting schools. I visited some art schools, some architecture schools. And what I really liked about the A at that point was that when I went in there, it was, as I was saying, the built form was not sort of necessarily at the forefront of that educational practice. What I saw was there was steel workshops and wood workshops, and people were making films, and there were, crazy installations that people were making. And I thought, this is great. Like, I could kind of come in here and try and explore different things. So I thought that more than the profession, I thought the place was really what I was attracted to. So when I joined it, that's exactly what I did. I sort of, I learned how to weld. I learned how to do woodwork. I learned how to cast concrete and lay bricks. And it was very, very hands-on. And I think now that I look back, I very deliberately chose units and masters through my 5 years, which allowed me to kind of, develop my skills of working with my hand. And, I was just now, in fact, talking to an ex-professor of mine, and she'd just gone and seen a work of mine at Frieze. And she said, it reminded me of something that I'd done with them in my third year. And I kind of then I had the moment to sort of go back and thinking that, I'd actually, probably my first real sculpture, it was at a gallery in London. It was actually then, when I was in third year, I kept thinking about it as more as an architectural sort of expression, but like, it was art. Well, it was both, which is kind of where I am right, So it kind of, it starts there, and it was like, and I was very kind of pleased to think about that, that was still there, that sense remained. So, yeah, what was your question? Or am I just rambling on about things?
How did it change your approach to art instead?
I don't know. I don't think it changed it. I think it formed it.
Okay.
So it's formative, right?
So that narrowed down what you wanted to do and where you wanted to be.
Oh, I still don't. Right. That's these forms of expression, like I don't know how they change. I mean, as I'm playing with animation right now, I'm sort of doing things that are interesting. But for me, it's always just like looking at sort of the urban landscape in some way or the other.
Being the son of Martand Khosla, a renowned architect, has that influenced your artistic practices in any way?
I think we're all sort of, influenced by our fathers in some way or the other, right? I mean, so I think the influence will be broader than just sort of saying that is it art. Like I would say that yes, I mean, having him as my father, and of course, not to mention my mother, who was really very instrumental in introducing me to art at an early age. So like from the age of 5 or 6, I used to sit and do kind of art projects with her, and she's a great painter. And so she sort of had an influence. But I think that, my parents sort of were very involved with this publication called the Journal of Arts and Ideas that came out in the 70s and 80s. So I grew up sort of being surrounded by artists, filmmakers, dancers, professors. So I think that, the influence kind of, one's parents enabled a lot of these influences in my life, as I'm sure they do for a lot of people. So yeah, I think, yeah. But specifically art in its sort of current sense, yeah, probably there as well,